everyone, and welcome to the International Society of Black Latinos conversation, something that we've titled From Trauma to Transformation. In this conversation, we will explore the intersection between the pandemic and social injustice. My name is Melissa Shepard-Williams. I'm a psychotherapist, professor, and one of the board members in this organization. This organization was founded by Juanita Palacios-Sims, who currently presides it. Let me introduce you to our wonderful panelists. First, Anaida Colón-Muñiz, who is a professor, and she has dedicated many years of her work in supporting teachers in bilingual education. Blain Watson, who is a professor and principal at Manuel Dominguez High School. Benny Blades, one of our board members, also representing education. He's a professor, counselor, and student advisor at Santa Monica College. And my colleague, Makisha Lawrence. Dr. Lawrence is a psychologist who is in private practice. I think a good place to start is to explore what is racism and what is systemic oppression, because this is a platform that would support us, hopefully, in looking at where the intersection is between the pandemic and social injustice. Would you like to start us, Makisha?
Okay, I say let's dance with this together.
Let us.
I think it's such a broad concept, racism, because it shows up in so many different ways that people are unaware of. But in my mind, racism is a fear-based belief system that has been established historically in order to accommodate one culture and diminish other cultures for the dominant culture's gain. That's a really simple way of thinking about it. I think what's difficult for people is that they don't understand in what ways systemic racism have been weaved through our country. Our country has been founded on it. The founding fathers were all a part of building it into the system. And so it shows up in school systems, it shows up in mental health, it shows up in hospitals, it shows up in television, it shows up just in our some everyday life things, as in why is it that there are not, this is a simple example, but you know, there were times where we wouldn't be able to find products for ourselves. And so it would take a lot just to find the product. And so a part of systemic racism makes things inaccessible. It makes things farther away from us and from those who experience the racism. But that's just a really small nugget of it.
Yes, and as you were saying, fear is the motivation for the choices made by the oppressor. Fear. And on that note, are we responsible, members of this African diaspora, where systemic oppression continues, are we responsible to diffuse the fears of the oppressors? And if so, how would we do that? That's a lot. And yet this is what marginalized people live with every day. Constantly watchful of how to navigate a world where systemic oppression has all these different approaches to keeping us down. So how do we survive? Anaida.
So I see racism is also a lot about power and privilege, having it, keeping it, protecting it, and benefiting, in the United States, the white majority, to maintain that system of power that, as Makisha says, comes from way back, from the beginning, from the period of colonization against indigenous people, from the time of slavery. I mean, it's embedded in the roots of this country, and I resist feeling like it's my responsibility or your responsibility. I think it's the responsibility also of allies, white allies, people who have become aware, to also take this on and have conversations amongst, the white population, because now this idea of acknowledging that there is such a thing as whiteness, and because before it was like, oh, there's no such thing. No, there is, and that people acknowledge it and talk about it, and about white fragility and the issues embedded in the society that are keeping, people of color in a subordinate position and having to fight constantly to gain any kind of place at the table. I think, those are conversations. I think it has to be across groups, but also within the white community. That those are difficult conversations, but there has to be a time when that, and I think the time is now. I think it's happening. I've seen it happening more than perhaps in the past, and I think that's, I think that's a hopeful sign, but that I don't think it's like our responsibility to have to always have the burden of educating or constantly be pushing. It's like, gets tiresome,
It does.
People are tired of having to.
Absolutely, and I'm glad to hear you mention that piece that so frequently is forgotten. The fact that it's exhausting. It's exhausting to be a member of the diaspora in this constant survival mode, and then also to be in the role of educating the lineage of oppressors. Makisha, I see that you wanted to join.
Yeah, I wanted to jump off of what Anaida said. I think that historically there has been a rhetoric of people of color trying to make the white culture feel safer. The stories were created by them, and yet we have been made over the course of time responsible to dispel the stories by acting as the safe person. And I think that that's been part of people of color survival as well. That becoming the safe person could be seen as a way of survival, could be seen as a way of maintaining the life and the livelihood of our families. But I don't think that it is our, and I agree with Anaida, I don't think that it is our responsibility to continue that part of the story, that those ideas about Black and Brown people that have been created were not created by us. And yet so they're a mythology that has been established over centuries, and then we are asked to dispel the myth.
Exactly. And as you mentioned, the stories that the oppressor has continuously, for generations, told themselves so that they can justify their actions, reminds me of a quote I reread recently by this amazing author, James Baldwin, who left us with words that are applicable today. And in this dance of exploring the stories that both the oppressor and the oppressed have told themselves, I would like to share this quote just briefly. He said, "I imagine one of the reasons people cling to their hates so stubbornly is because they sense once hate is gone, they will be forced to deal with pain." And so as the oppressed become more and more aware of the history of trauma and protest against it, as we have seen in this global crisis, the oppressor feels the need to up the ante for fear that they will have to now deal with what they have been ignoring. You know, the pain of truly recognizing why they have been doing what they have been doing, that it does not match the so-called moral values that they uphold. They've had to tell themselves that we are not human so that it justifies their actions. In our mental health world, we call that cognitive dissonance. There is not a match between the belief and the actions. So they don't want to look at that. And so we are constantly held responsible for keeping them safe. Well, we need to heal ourselves. What are your thoughts on that, Blain?
First of all, I want to thank everyone and Melissa for organizing and facilitating this conversation on race. And I want to say that, you know, race it's important for us to discuss because any lack of dialogue about race is a form of inaction, right? That leaves assumptions unexamined about the social constructs of race, about discrimination, and like you said, about the experiences of the oppressed, but also those of the oppressor. One thing that I really want to just draw on just as a frame that we can think about is just understanding that, you know, it's important to view race as an evolving ideology. And something that I've learned is that it's a social, physical, legal, and historical construct, right? And built to draw distinctions between people of color so that some might benefit at the expense of others. And so, you know, race, from our humble beginnings as human beings, race never really existed. Race is something that was constructed to divide, and some would say to also to conquer, right? So I think that's important for, as we're talking about youth, because I know that we're going to be leading to that conversation later on in this conversation. It's important for us to have those conversations with our youth. That it's, you know, our kids identify naturally because they're forced to, and us as adults, we've been forced to identify ourselves through race. But that's not necessarily how we started, right, as a human community. And I think we're at a point in life in our world where we have to come back to our humble beginnings as humans and really see really human race as a human race, and stop drawing these lines of distinction between race, which lead to, for example, segregation and desegregation. And again, we're back into a segregated society, right, in education and in living, redlining. So, you know, history, like they say, is repeating itself right now. When we had horrible experiences with race, you know, 100, 150 years ago, and way before that, right? We're living it again in this country. There is a great awakening happening right now, I really believe, in many different industries, in many different circles around the world. However, we still need to abolish this idea as race as something that can't be deconstructed. I really believe race can be deconstructed so that we can talk about our characteristics and uniqueness as human beings. You know, and that's kind of where I'm thinking right now, is like, how as educators and as parents, because parents by default, right, and de facto, we are educators in our home. And so whether we come from the background of being the oppressed or the oppressor, we have a responsibility and a moral imperative to teach our kids about race being something that was constructed to keep other groups away from privilege. So that's where my mind is right now, and it's painful to see, you know, the divide that's happening in our world, but it's also needed. People needed to, like they say, you know, in popular culture, to be woke, you know, and there's a lot of wokeness happening right now, and we need to keep this spark alive. And I don't know what that looks like, because it's not something It's not something that's going to happen immediately. It's something that needs to be a continual conversation that's supported by legislation. It's supported by, you know, just social action, and also just supported in our classrooms, but also in our homes as that original classroom.
Yes, let's keep the momentum.
Mm-hmm.
This is a time of reckoning. Benny, please share with us your thoughts, your concerns.
We have a class that we're going to be doing at Santa Monica College for employees, administrators, and faculty called Supporting Men of Color. And we had an orientation yesterday when we had about 70 employees on the Zoom. What was interesting in the beginning, it wasn't that many black males on the Zoom, maybe 4 out of 75. In the beginning, all the talking was done by the black males. Well, the presenter was a black male, but all the input in the beginning, like most people kind of nervous, and they were. But one of the things that came out was that in education, some of the things they brought out, there was a lot of disdain and a lot of fear. But one of the guys who worked for the police department on Santa Monica College said, you know, people call the police on me. I was just playing dominoes. I work with the police department. And he said the comments he get from the police is that they get a lot of calls they should not be getting because of fear. When a lot of the instructors see black male and other men of color, mostly black male, they have fear. So anything that the black male does becomes a police matter. And they'll call in the police, and because of some of the histories that some of the people have had, it creates even more problems. An example I gave was my girlfriend, when she was teaching El Segundo, she was always being stopped by the police, you know, and to this day, even though it was decades ago, he still has a lot of emotion from the experience. And when I got stopped by the police about a week ago and told her about it, she was highly upset because it brought up memories when she was stopped, and the fact that she has a grown African-American male son. She is very nervous about what will happen to him if he gets stopped. And some of the people on the call was really shocked the fact that she was a teacher. I said, not like she looked like a thug. She was a gymnast in college, and you look at it back there, she had walked out of a fashion magazine, so she did not have a look as though she was a criminal. They stopped her because she was black, and she knew that. And she said she got stopped about 5 times when she was younger. And that was profound. But the fact that a lot of faculty and teachers fear black males has a lot to do with how they interact with them. Another thing that came out, the fact that they have low expectations of our kids, especially the males, and the fact that they all come from environments where education was not really valued. So therefore, this process in terms of how they interact and their expectations are all painted by that. I thought that was a really, really good orientation yesterday. Then one of the things that I also mentioned was, I'll be brief, not to use the term, I don't see color. But one of the biggest books that came out a few years ago was Color Blindness is the New Jim Crow. So when you telling people you don't see color, I mean, you don't see the impact of their color has on how they're being treated by others.
I want to thank you for sharing, you know, just the fear that many people have of the presence of black males in our field of education. It shows up in you're talking about with faculty, right? Some people are intimidated by the ability of many black males and don't want to. Again, talking about the social contract, right? There's many legal and social and even professional obstacles that are put in place to keep black males and other men of color and women of color away from certain opportunities, right? Because there may be a fear that they may be able to perform better or have a different insight than other people have. But it also shows up in the classroom, you know, in K-12, kindergarten through 12th grade, you know, where black males are disproportionately suspended from school, right, for lower level offenses. Black males are also disproportionately identified for special education, right, and oftentimes misidentified, and then that lowers their opportunity to be able to matriculate into college because they have to take additional classes that are keeping them further behind, and they're not taking the college curriculum. And it has a lot to do with fear in the classroom, right, because Black males and in general African American culture sometimes expresses African American culture express themselves differently in social settings, right? Or learn differently than other students, right? And so that it tends to be interpreted as this person is overly aggressive, or this person, you know, can't contain themselves or can't control themselves. Well, it's really about, you know, their cultural norms within different, you know, these different constructs we're talking about of people and where they're from and how they're raised. And so it really, it's not about, you know, people seeing people through color. It's color lens. We have to see people through their cultural lens and how they're raised, right? And what their experiences are. And once we have that paradigm, people will be less intimidated, I believe, by African American and other students of color, and give them more opportunities, and don't see them as someone who's going to challenge them in the classroom, but be a contributing factor to the learning that's happening for everyone else, including the teacher. The teacher also needs to learn from his or her students in the classroom.
Absolutely. And, you know, you both point out how Black males are consistently seen as and constantly experiencing things that show the inequities in the way resources are distributed. And that phrase, "I don't see color," is yet one more of endless ways of invalidating someone's identity.
And also invalidating their own bias, right? We all come with bias. And, you know, when we talk about the research around implicit bias, the growth we'll feel as a community, as a society, is when everyone explores their own bias. Black people have bias against other Black people, right? Latino people have bias against other Latino people, right? So no one is exempt from this idea of bias. I'm sorry for interrupting, Melissa, but I was just as passionate as you were talking about Black males being, you know, seen as a threat. You know, to hear that Benny was you know, pulled over just last week, you know he's an educated Black male, serves the community well, you know, works at a premier community college here in Southern California, right? And well respected in the community. What threat does he pose to the community, right? You know, and I'm sure what he did, you know, if it's a traffic infraction, it's not as egregious as any other white man or white woman, right, that's driving down the street doing maybe the same thing, but he's a target because he's a threat.
Exactly. And people are perceived as a threat because of the fear we've been talking about. Makisha, you were going to add.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, is that again goes back to the mythology, right? So the historical mythology of Black bodies are dangerous. And that is weaved throughout our United States cultural narrative, and then weaved throughout the dominant, the majority culture's narrative as well, that Black bodies are dangerous, and so they must be over-policed. Black bodies are dangerous, and so they must be watched at all costs. Black bodies are dangerous, and so we need to make sure that we are corralling them and keeping them in their cages, in the cages that we create, in order for us to feel safe. And that gets shown in the educational system with our boys, and that gets shown in the policing system. Is that and then to what Blaine was saying about, you know, different cultures express in different ways, and so the way that African American or Afro-Latino or Afro-Caribbean people express themselves is viewed as can be viewed as aggressive, whereas within the community it could be viewed as passionate.
Right.
And one is not threatening a threat. Threatening. I'm creating new words. One is not a threat, right? Passionate. The word passionate is not a threat. Right. But if we like watch our men, you know, just watching a football game, right? And how people are talking to the screen, and you know, there's a lot of like gesturing, and there's a lot of, you know, vocalization, and all of that is excitement and passion. But if we move that context out on a street corner, then it gets viewed as suspicious.
Exactly. Cultural context. And then there is the cultural and historical context of the policing narrative. I mean, all we have to do is go back to the history of enslavement and how enslaved people were essentially policed to prevent runaways. So that sets the precedent. It sets the tone for how we are watched. Everywhere in the world, we are watched as a threat.
That's interesting. You're talking about how we are watched. You know, I'm looking at the historical context. We're watched because we're fleeing, so we have to be supervised because we have to be contained. But then the other thing is that we're watched because we're also walked in a spectator type of fashion, right? So black people have to be contained. Can't let them go too far because we need to keep it close. And the second, black people are, you know, they're on the screen or they're in the Coliseum. You know, they're competing, and they're going to be, you know, that there goes that threat again. The black bodies are strong. We're going to contain them, and we're going to contain their strength for our entertainment, right? That's what we
Gladiators.
you know, they have to entertain us with their strength. That's how we feel less threatened when they're serving a purpose for us, right? You see that in basketball and football, right? Even somewhat in baseball, right? Most flashy players are usually, you know, African American males, right? Most skilled players are usually African American males, right? So,
and there's another part to that I know I personally run into, which is, you know, that cross section also with our Latino culture and our love of, you know, also of music and being kind of, you know, flashy, the dress and laughing, and I actually have run into that where I've had people say, you know, like there's an assumption that because we know how to have fun or dance or laugh or sing, that we can't be smart, you know, and that we can't write or that we can't do other things. And I actually, you know, worked on a book with a colleague of mine who's Cuban, and you know, I had someone say, "Oh, you wrote a book? I always see you as dancing, you know, or laughing." And I'm thinking,
amazing.
a lot of things, you know. It's not like I have to just do one thing. It's like there's this assumption that we don't have the capacity to be good leaders or to, you know, take on serious roles because we're just too, you know, we just have too much fun. And I'm thinking, God, I remember, you know, I was director of an office in Orange County in a school district, and we laughed and we, you know, were loud, but boy, we were the hardest working team. And there are others who come like saying, "Oh no, you have to be quiet. You can't make noise. Don't bring food. You know, don't socialize." And I'm thinking, I mean, to me, that's the best, is to enjoy your work and to work as hard as you can. And there's no reason why you can't do it all, you know. And so I've run into like these microaggressions that are also constantly, you know, put upon us, you know, because of that cultural piece, you know, that is so important to I think our survival, you know, as people. And it's just been something that I've had to also encounter in my life, and I know many others have as well. And it stops you many times from being taken seriously when you want to, for example, go for a position, a different position that's perhaps, you know, in a higher leadership position or something. They say, "Oh, really? I don't think they can do it because, you know, they're not really able to, or they're just not going to take it seriously, or they're not going to work that hard."
Speaking of microaggressions, that subtle ways in which we are constantly attacked with words, even with gestures. And because you brought up the topic of the workplace, I think it's important that we also explore today, you know, how do we assert ourselves in the workplace and navigate what may be fear of retaliation, simply because we express our thoughts and our feelings, even if we do so respectfully, professionally. What are your thoughts on that?
you know, I have a big mouth, and in my job, I mean, I have a hard time not saying what I feel, or feeling like if I don't say this, I'm not being true to myself, and calling out when I see something that's not right. And my attitude has been, you know, well, what's the worst they can do? They can fire me. But that's also in reflection of a position of privilege, because there are some people that can't do that. You know, they don't have, they're, you know, assuming that everybody can do that and just say, well, I'll just go get a job somewhere else. That's not always true. And that's unfair also, is that I have to be mindful, you know, of that part, that just because maybe I feel that way, or I live under conditions where I could survive, you know, if I had to leave a particular position, that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody can do that. And so I have to be mindful of that, but I find it so hard to be silenced. You know, it's like, my father taught me that, you know, just to speak up. If you see injustice, don't stay quiet. But that's not everybody. So I have to, you know, also be respectful that everybody's in a different place and may have different situations, you know, so.
Very important. So there's a multitude of narratives in the way we in this diaspora experience pain and different levels of privilege, to have access to certain resources, to have access to the idea that we could leave this job today and go to another one more readily. You know, this experience of survival mode is not exactly the same for everyone, and that's something to be mindful of.
You're talking about fear. I just wanted, this was lingering in my mind. Think about some research that I've studied on just the growing population of minorities.
Yes.
By 2041, the nation's population, I'm reading a quote here, says, people of color are projected to make up the majority of the nation's population by the year 2041. So, and more says, it is important to examine how and why racial disparity between whites and people of color can exist in every institution across society, in many cases increasing rather than decreasing. And that's from the book by D'Angelo. What's the book called? It's real popular right now. Come on, you mentioned it. White
fragility. Yeah.
White fragility.
There you go. So what I'm curious about here is, hold on, my son's about to stop. Thank you. But the music is about to come out because it's playing music in the house. What I'm curious about is that the fear that many of the oppressors are feeling, is that they're seeing that this population is shifting and way more minorities, right, in the next 20 years or sooner than anticipated.
Yes.
I suspect the same. Because other than the upheaval in these protests, it's just the sheer numbers of us add to their experience of threat is what I suspect. You know, Benny, please add on to that.
Also, Trump, when he ran for office in 2016, he appealed to that narrative that whites, this is like their last hurrah. We don't do something now, we're gonna become, we're gonna lose our privilege. So he has played on that in 2016. He's trying to do the same thing right now, but things are different. You have a different white population now. The younger whites have integrated more with other people of color. They had a black president for 8 years. They're marrying other people outside their group. They're going to school with other people outside their group. So you're dealing with a different population. So even though he's trying to appeal to that group that put him in office in 2016, we have the pandemic. A lot of people lost somebody. Somebody know people who are sick of COVID-19. A lot of people lost their job. And they even found out yesterday, 54% of the Republicans now are concerned about COVID-19 and the pandemic. So the tide has shifted. We're probably gonna have a landslide in terms of the election. But he appealed to that narrative that if you don't vote me in, you're gonna lose your privilege and your power, because those people will not and he's constantly sending messages about police, about Black Lives Matter. He's trying to equate that with hate groups, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And that's the basis of his election now, because he's lost everything else.
Yeah, you mentioned how it impacts the workplace situation. So, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are about how, you know, because of people losing their jobs, along with losing people, loved ones who have passed away because of COVID, we are all experiencing diverse versions of grief. You know, loss of loved ones, loss of work, a loss of sense of safety. Whatever safety we thought we had, we're wondering if we still have it. So what are your thoughts on that, Makisha?
I think that's I feel like that's at least the behaviors, some of the behaviors that we're seeing that are not in support of protecting the collective is also about power. And so if we're going to grieve, then we're also, this pandemic is encouraging us to kind of look at the ways in which we do have privilege, and also to look at the disparities, and to possibly have this moment to grieve the loss of, you can't control this, right? I can, you know, historically, I can create a myth to establish that other cultures are not as good as another culture. Historically, I can police bodies, Black and brown bodies. Historically, I can make it difficult for you to access medical care, mental health, those kinds of things, but you are not going to control a virus. And so there's a lot of grief around loss of control. You never had control in the first place, but that's what we like to believe. But this is kind of a, I don't want to say an equalizer, because I don't think it's that. But this is the responses that we're getting are allowing us to kind of look at the ways that maybe we were able to navigate that we no longer feel like we can navigate in order to support the collective. So that's, and when I mean support the collective, I mean protect each other as best we can in terms of, you know, masking and washing hands and that kind of thing. So.
Exactly, and you know, you were talking about loss of control, and that's one of the key ingredients in trauma. And as a people, we have experienced trauma from one generation to another, and the pandemic is adding another layer to this sense of loss of control. You know, supporting each other includes touch, and you know, this physical distancing is saying no touching. This really, really difficult. Anaida.
I was just going to mention about what Blain had mentioned, and Benny, about the population and the fear about, you know, the population of the United States shifting, and how that has been. I remember when they were predicting this, you know, whatever, 20 years ago or something, and it set out like this tremendous fear of, oh my God, you know, we're losing, you know, the United States. That's how come they have those hats that say "Make America White Again." It's like fear of, oh my God, it's not, and yet you have, you know, all this blending, as you mentioned, going on with intermarriage, and people, you know, young people having a whole different vision. They look at the world differently, many of them. But one thing I was going to say is that California, places like California and New York are different than other parts of the country, you know, where we could turn on the television and we could see newscasters that come from a variety of backgrounds. But you go to different parts of the country and it's still not like that. You know, like I'm sometimes, you know, you travel, you go, oh, wow. You know, it's so weird to be watching TV and there's like not one person of color. You know, it's like we are the future. We represent the future of the United States. They look, and that's why there's sometimes this resistance to New York and California, because we like represent. This is what the world really is like, and what the United States is going to look like, you know, as time passes. And there is that tremendous amount of worry, and yet, you know, I go to LA. I love going to LA. It's like everybody's everywhere, and you know, and I still live in Orange County, which still has some resistance. You know, there's still pockets of resistance. You know,
Yeah.
but you know, but in generally speaking, you know, in the bigger cities, and we really do represent the future of the United States, and there is that worry, and yet, hey, we're still here. Everything's okay.
Yeah.
Not gonna fall off the planet.
I would say I have a concern, Anaida, thank you for, going back to the population shift. I have a concern that the pandemic may work in competition with, or maybe working in contrast with, the movement that we're seeing in Black Lives Matter, and bringing more awareness to the idea of diversity. Why? Because exactly to your point, you're talking about how, there's a lot more intermarriage happening. There's a lot more diversity initiatives happening. But if we're not out there, and we can't be out there seeing it, right, and experiencing it and interacting and touching it, right, on a daily basis, it may stagger, right, the change that we actually can exercise, right. So I'm concerned that the restrictions we have with the pandemic in terms of social and physical distancing won't allow us to really reap the true benefits that this Black Lives Matter can really offer, not just the United States, but the world, right? And so we have the spaces to be able to allow that to shine through. How else do we manifest the real change that Black Lives Matter is bringing to the world? And I think in order to take advantage of this momentum, we have to be deliberate about finding ways to highlight how important this movement is to the world, because people are remaining so secluded right now. It's hard, right, to really see it and experience it firsthand. Because a big part of Black Lives Matter is bringing people together and talking, and as therapists, and as educators, we know, bringing people together and talking in a room, the dynamic is much more special than having a Zoom conversation.
Absolutely, absolutely, and yet thankfully we have this.
Yes.
Because we're trying to connect, and the pandemic has caused such a pause, if you will, because we have to be home in this quarantine, and not for everyone it's a safe situation, because speaking of mental health, a lot of people who are home are not safe. Whatever dangers they experienced before the pandemic have increased. So a lot of mental health issues that pre-existed have become more intensified. And the pandemic itself is creating some issues in mental health, with anxiety, with depression. And so, yes, the electronic way is not optimum, but thankfully we have that. But at the same time, and this reminds me of conversations we've all had privately, not everybody has access to these electronic ways of communicating. So the isolation is significant for them. Yet one more example of how resources are not available to everyone. True in education, as you have shared, Blain and Benny and Anaida, not everybody has been able to adjust the teleeducation in the same way. Telework, difficult. Makisha and I were talking about how challenging it is to be in therapy on screen. It's very different. Nothing like being in person, like you were saying, Blain, because healing requires coming together.
Right.
So there are a lot of factors to consider. Children are experiencing this in a really specific way. And if we as adults are not fully emotionally present, they are in trouble. They are in trouble. Makisha, please take it away.
I don't know if I want to take it away, but I kind of want to tie what Blain and what Anaida said about, Anaida was saying about, California and New York are kind of like these demonstration states, the states that are showing how different cultures can live together and benefit from each other, and love each other and honor each other's cultural identities, and at the same time allow progression to happen. And so the hope that I have, kind of tying that into what Blain was saying about, you know, feeling fearful about that we're not able to see these things. The hope that I have is that the model states will, that the modeling will spread. That's what I'm hoping. I think that what I'm seeing, at least with college students, I don't know, Anaida, if you're seeing this too, but what I'm seeing with college students is that they have already been born into the technology culture. And though I've gotten the phrase from them, touch starved. So though they recognize that they need touch, they need that interaction, they're also very good at keeping in contact with each other and sharing information in such a way. Benny's nodding his head too, so I know you're probably seeing that on the college campus. So, you know, they have this way of kind of sharing information with regards to BLM, and that BLM is again about bearing witness. You know, we talked about that in the last time. It's like, don't look away. I want you to look at this. I want you to look at this because it's not just for me. It's also for you. If you can take the tenets of BLM and then apply them to yourself in terms of examining your own biases, then the growth is not just for me, it's for you.
Yes.
And as you continue to grow, then you spread that to somebody else, and then they spread that to somebody else. And that's the hope that I have, is that with the college population that we're seeing, is they already have that level of fluency in terms of technology and interacting, and they have a lot of energy in terms of, you know, being on social media platforms and kind of sharing these ideals with each other. So that's the shift that I'm hoping for.
Thank you for sharing that, Makisha, because that definitely addresses one of the topics that we really wanted to explore today, and that's the healing process. You know, the different ways of supporting ourselves, our individual health, as well as, you know, in relation to the people that we interact with. And whether it's the academic setting or any other setting, you know, that my healing invites someone else's healing.
Yes.
And I think one of the things that you have all brought up before is something that we need to revisit, and that is the value of improving our education about our history, and that recognizing that the more information we receive about our history, not only about our pain history, but about the positive experience of being an African in the world, is going to help our identity development, which has been interrupted by constantly being in survival mode, you know, but it's going to be a painful learning process too, to learn more deeply about why we're in pain. And that's one of the reasons why it was helpful to come together as educators and mental health professionals, because our work can come together so that while we're all learning about the history, we're also addressing the pain that comes with processing that history. It's not easy to hear about the layers of pain we've gone through from generation to generation. So that's why the International Society of Black Latinos, which is all about educating and uniting communities, saw it fit to bring together teachers and therapists to talk about how we cooperate in this healing process. Yes, Anaida.
You know, you had mentioned in some of the questions that had come up originally about the difference between change and transformation. And in sort of exploring that, so I have my view, you know, about how transformation is so much more radical than change. But I found this one quote that I thought was was really cool. It said change is doing things differently. Transformation is a new way of being. And I think that's what we need. It's a new way of being. It's like we could make policies and from the outside try to pressure people to do, the right thing this way or the other. But
Right.
until we really change our way of belief, that, we're not going to really see that permanent sort of, transformation in our society that we so desperately need in order to live in peace, in order to value each other and to love each other. And I think that, is something that I think education does help with, as, we are in such an important role of helping children grow and see the world in new ways and sort of getting that consciousness,
Yeah.
that's also where hope lies, but it's work.
It is a lot of work, and we need to support each other because, yes, we need to match new actions to new mindsets so that transformation can happen. Benny, what are your thoughts on this?
I wanted to also talk about some of the problems we've having with students who are at a major disadvantage because of the pandemic. We have a lot of students who don't have access to Wi-Fi, and we have a lot of students who don't have access to laptops, so they're falling way, way behind. And also students who are in special ed.
Mm-hmm.
Those students are really, really challenged, especially in the K through 12. At our level community colleges, what we did was we went out and bought a lot of Chromebooks, to the point where we still have Chromebooks left over. We set up Wi-Fi spots on a campus from a certain time, so if students can't get Wi-Fi at home, there's 2 of our campuses they can come to and use that Wi-Fi. But one of the biggest need we found out too was food.
Mm-hmm.
Food was one of the biggest needs. We did a survey as soon as this thing hit, and food was a huge issue. So what we did, we worked with Everyday Table, and we started distributing food, about 5 to 7 meals a week to over 1,000 students. We've been doing it since the middle of March, and they sign up every week. We go as far as almost to Watts, as far as Boyle Heights, all the way into as far as Plymouth. And we also do a food distribution every Wednesday, not only students, but both faculty and staff too.
Mm.
Matter of fact, that's what happened when I got pulled over. I was coming from delivering food.
Wow.
I decided to go down Crenshaw, and this police officer pulled me over. I didn't have a,
You're a threat. Delivering food, you're a threat.
Right. ISBL, as you know, Benny, being one of the board members, has also been participating in this effort to help provide food to communities that are in need, because, this pandemic has really put a magnifying lens on how there's inequities in public health, education, and you name it. You name it. Since you brought up, Benny, the issue of the lack of access to the necessary technology to do the educational work at home, you reminded me of a conversation we had before, and Blain, please jump in, on how might student achievement gaps in public education be affected as a result of all the school closures and distance learning.
There definitely has to be a focus, a very poignant focus on the most at promise, most vulnerable kids in schools right now. So to name some of those and how the state identifies the most vulnerable kids, we're talking about kids who are in foster care, kids who are home, students with disabilities like Benny mentioned, and also English language learners. And then there are many kids racially who fall within every single one of those 4 categories that I mentioned. And what we know, just like you said, Melissa, that this pandemic and COVID-19 specifically has exacerbated, right, all the existing opportunity and achievement gaps that we know exist for those subgroups of kids, right? And for every other kid, because it's not just about lack of access and there's lack of training for teachers, right? So and I would even say that that's another gap that we're missing here, is how many teachers are being well trained in how to pivot to distance and remote learning. And distance learning is not as easy as many people make it seem to be, right? And it's not as easy as many people make it seem to be. We have many in the teaching force who are extremely antiquated in their practices. We have problems with a lot of teachers who just wouldn't, we're in the 21st century. We talk about 21st century teaching skills and learning skills, right? But we have teachers who are still teaching as if they're in the 80s, right? And so, some teachers who still want to use an overhead projector, right? That still want to use, those what they call the overhead projector with the Sharpie, not the Sharpie, the dry erase markers, right? We still have teachers who are so comfortable using that old approach, right? And they don't want to move into a new area. So I think there's not just a student divide, right, and lack of access and lack of knowledge. There's also we need to bridge the knowledge gap for teachers and for administrators. As administrator right now, my job was to immediately pivot my campus, my teaching staff, to a whole new paradigm of teaching and learning. And so that had to start with the principal being what we're supposed to be, being the chief and principal learner on campus. Somebody who's going to be ahead of the curve, someone who's going to go to as many different capacity building sessions and online sessions and learning about how to define distance learning. What does asynchronous versus synchronous learning look like, right? How do you differentiate within those two approaches? What is a suggested amount or appropriate amount of suggested screen time for kids? For a teenager, in terms of adaptive learning for kids, what does it look like for a teenager versus a middle schooler versus an elementary child, right? There's so many things that we have to consider and really flip how we do everything until we really get that as an education industry and leaders and teachers working together in terms of how to deliver instruction. We're not going to address those learning gaps.
Exactly.
We also have a huge learning curve ourselves that we have to move through before we can even. No one's really talked about that. People talk about the kids don't have access. Kids don't have access. Well, teachers don't know what the hell they're doing.
Exactly. So on that note, although
I say that not to disrespect teachers, there's several teachers who know what they're doing. I'm just saying, teaching force, I'm advocating for teachers. Teachers really don't know what they're doing because this is not something teachers were prepared to do.
Exactly. And none of us were prepared to deal with a pandemic. The last one happened 100 years ago. So there's a number of factors that are intermingling. And although you're talking about the academic setting, needing flexibility, we all could benefit from developing flexibility. And yet it is such a struggle, especially for those of us in the world that have been in survival mode for generations. This panel includes Cuba, Panama, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, the US. And, because it's the International Society of Black Latinos, exploring this topic, we definitely want to acknowledge that these issues are also having their own version in different countries in the diaspora. And on that note, I want to thank you all for coming together today to explore this topic that is so layered. We could have part 2, 3, 4, 5.
I'm sad we're done.
And so it's good because exploration is one of the key ingredients for healing, like water for soup.
There you go.
You want to give us one last word briefly?
Just one correction. We had a pandemic in 2009, the swine flu. The difference is we had an adult who was the president, and we didn't feel it hardly at all because he handled it like an adult. But that was a worldwide pandemic in 2009. We only lost 13,000 Americans. Right now, we lose that many almost a month now.
Crazy. Well, May growth prevail, and may this turning point in history be like no other. Again, thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you for